Picture a hunter, 40,000 years ago, crouched motionless in tall grass. He hears a bird overhead suddenly change its call, a sharp panicked series of notes, completely different from its usual song. He doesn't know the species name, he's never studied it, but he freezes instantly, because he knows exactly what that sound means. Something dangerous is moving nearby, and it hasn't seen him yet. That hunter didn't speak bird, but in a very real sense, he understood it. He'd heard that alarm call 100 times before, paired it with 100 outcomes, and built, without ever writing a single word down, something close to a working translation in his head. So here's the real question. Could ancient humans actually understand animal language? Not in the fantasy sense. No one was having full conversations with wolves. But in a functional life-or-death sense, how much of the animal world could our prehistoric ancestors actually read? The answer turns out to be stranger, more sophisticated, and more essential to human survival than most people realize. Before we go further, we need to be precise about what we're actually asking. Animals don't have language in the way humans do, a system of arbitrary symbols that can be combined into infinite new meanings. What most animals have instead is a communication system, a limited set of calls, postures, and signals tied to specific, recurring situations: danger, food, mating, readiness, territory, distress. This distinction matters, because it changes the question from could ancient humans speak wolf, which is essentially meaningless, to something much more answerable. Could ancient humans accurately interpret and predict animal communication signals well enough to use them for survival? And on that second question, the evidence strongly suggests the answer is yes, not through any kind of magical or telepathic ability, but through something arguably more impressive: an enormous, hard-earned, generational body of practical knowledge, built by people whose lives quite literally depended on getting it right. Modern researchers studying animal communication, for example. The well-known research on vervet monkeys, who use distinct alarm calls for different predators like eagles, snakes, and leopards, each triggering a different evasive behavior in the group, have shown that animal communication is often more structured and specific than people assume. Ancient humans, living in far closer daily contact with wild animals than almost anyone today, would have been exposed to these kinds of signal systems constantly, across dozens of species, for their entire lives. For most of human history, hunting wasn't just about strength or speed. It was fundamentally an exercise in interpretation, reading an animal's body, sound, and behavior accurately enough to predict what it would do next. Often from a distance, and often with only seconds to react correctly. Consider what a successful hunt actually required. A hunter needed to distinguish between an animal that was alert but unaware of them, versus one that had detected their presence and was about to flee. These states often look almost identical to an untrained eye: a slight shift in ear position, a change in how a tail moves, a subtle head turn, but they mean completely different things. And reacting incorrectly could mean the difference between a successful hunt and days of wasted effort, or in the case of dangerous prey, serious injury or death. Anthropological studies of modern hunter-gatherer societies, groups like the San of the Kalahari or the Hadza of Tanzania, whose traditional practices offer researchers a window into skills likely shared by ancient humans for tens of thousands of years, reveal an extraordinarily detailed vocabulary of animal behavior interpretation. Sand trackers, for example, are documented reading not just footprints, but the specific gait, weight distribution, and even the emotional state of an animal, from tracks alone, determining whether it was relaxed, alarmed, injured, or fleeing, sometimes hours after the animal had passed. This isn't guesswork. It's a learned, transmitted body of knowledge, passed down explicitly from one generation to the next, refined constantly through direct experience. Alongside visual tracking, sound was just as critical. Many prey animals and predators alike produce distinct vocalizations tied to specific states: distress calls, warning calls, mating calls, calls between a mother and offspring. A hunter who could distinguish between these calls gained enormous advantages, knowing when a herd was calm and approachable, when it had been spooked by something else entirely, or when a predator was already stalking the same prey they were after. This kind of knowledge wasn't limited to prey animals either. Understanding predator behavior and vocalization was equally, if not more, essential for survival. Recognizing the difference between a distant, non-threatening growl and the specific vocal patterns that preceded an actual attack could be the difference between life and death for early humans, sharing landscapes with large predators like cave lions, saber-toothed cats, and giant hyenas. One of the most fascinating and well-supported ideas in this space is that ancient humans likely relied heavily on birds, not as prey, but as an early warning system, essentially outsourcing a portion of their situational awareness to the alarm calls of the birds around them. Many bird species have distinct alarm calls that shift dramatically when a predator is nearby, and these calls often differ depending on the type of threat, a call for a ground predator like a big cat is frequently different from a call for an aerial predator like a hawk, because the appropriate evasive response is different in each case. Prey animals throughout an ecosystem, including humans, could learn to interpret these differences. This isn't a purely theoretical idea. Researchers studying present-day hunter-gatherer and small-scale traditional societies have documented extensive, detailed local knowledge of bird alarm calls being actively used for exactly this purpose, as a real-time warning network for approaching predators or other people. It's reasonable, and broadly supported by anthropologists, to conclude that ancient humans, living in constant close contact with these same ecological relationships for tens of thousands of years, would have developed and relied on this same kind of knowledge as a routine part of daily survival, not as some rare specialized skill. This also extended beyond birds. Many mammals, deer, antelope, and various other prey species have their own alarm signals, including specific postures, sounds, and even scent-marking behaviors used to warn other members of a group. Ancient humans moving through shared landscapes with these animals for their entire lives would have picked up on these patterns constantly, essentially learning to read an entire ecosystem's alert system, not just isolated animal behaviors. Perhaps the single most direct piece of evidence that ancient humans developed genuine two-way communication with another species comes from the domestication of the wolf, the ancestor of the domestic dog. Genetic and archaeological evidence suggests this relationship began developing tens of thousands of years ago, likely starting with wolves that were less fearful of humans scavenging near human camps, gradually evolving into a working partnership. What makes this process remarkable from a communication standpoint is that it required something genuinely bidirectional. Humans and wolves each had to learn to read the other's signals accurately enough to cooperate, rather than either species simply reacting on pure instinct. This wasn't a passive process. Successfully working alongside a wolf, and eventually an early domesticated dog, during activities like tracking and hunting large game required humans to interpret canine body language, posture, ear position, tail movement, specific barks and growls tied to different situations with real precision. A hunting partnership depended on a human correctly reading, for example, the difference between a dog signaling that prey had been located versus a dog signaling danger from a different direction. At the same time, evidence from the behavior of modern wolves and dogs suggests that canines are unusually attentive to human gestures and vocal tone compared to many other domesticated species, an ability that likely developed, at least in part, specifically because of this long history of close cooperative contact with humans. In other words, this wasn't humans passively decoding wolves. It was a genuine coevolution of mutual communication, refined over an enormous span of time, between two species that needed to understand each other well enough to hunt as a coordinated team. This relationship offers some of the strongest evidence we have that ancient humans weren't just passively observing animal behavior from a distance. In at least this one relationship, they were actively building an interspecies communication system, refined generation after generation, that worked well enough to fundamentally reshape how both species lived. Some of the most striking direct evidence for just how closely ancient humans studied animal behavior comes from cave art itself, paintings created tens of thousands of years ago, found at sites across the world. What stands out to researchers studying these images isn't just that ancient artists could draw animals accurately. It's that many of these paintings capture specific behavioral moments, animals mid-stride in a particular gait, herds in defensive formations, predators in stalking postures, details that require sustained, careful observation of live animal behavior to render accurately, rather than working from a static or imagined image. Some researchers studying the famous cave paintings at sites like Lascaux and Chauvet in France have pointed out that certain animals are depicted with multiple, overlapping leg positions, an artistic technique some interpret as an early attempt to convey motion, essentially trying to capture the animal's movement, not just its static appearance. Whether or not every interpretation of these techniques is universally agreed upon, the underlying point stands. Creating these images required extraordinarily close, repeated observation of live animal behavior, in a level of detail that goes well beyond simply knowing what an animal looked like. This kind of art reflects a culture where understanding animal behavior wasn't just a practical hunting skill, but something significant enough to be recorded, honored, and passed down visually, suggesting that animal behavior and communication weren't seen as separate from human culture, but deeply woven into it. Beyond the practical, survival-driven understanding of animal behavior, there's strong evidence that many ancient and early human cultures believed, on a spiritual or mythological level, that direct communication with animals was genuinely possible, not just as folklore, but as a sincerely held part of their worldview. Anthropological and archaeological evidence from a wide range of ancient and traditional societies points to belief systems often broadly described as animism, the idea that animals, like humans, possess spirits, intelligence, and the capacity for meaningful communication with people. particularly through specific individuals, such as shamans, believed to have the ability to cross that communication barrier. Cave paintings and carved artifacts from various prehistoric sites include figures that researchers often interpret as therianthropes, part human, part animal figures, which many scholars believe reflect these early spiritual beliefs about the relationship, and even blurred boundary between human and animal consciousness. The famous sorcerer figure at the Trois-Frères cave in France, a partially animal, partially human painted figure dating back roughly 13,000 to 15,000 years, is one widely cited example that researchers often connect to these kinds of beliefs. Whether or not these beliefs reflected any literal, measurable ability to communicate with animals in the way modern science would define it, they reveal something important. Ancient humans didn't necessarily draw a sharp line between human and animal communication. In many ancient cultures, the idea that a skilled, spiritually attuned person could understand and even converse with animals wasn't seen as fantasy. It was considered a real, if rare and special, human capability. So where does the honest, evidence-based answer actually land? Ancient humans almost certainly could not understand animal communication in the way they understood spoken human language, as an open-ended system, capable of expressing complex, abstract, or entirely novel ideas. But within the narrower, survival-relevant sense of accurately predicting what a specific sound, posture, or behavior meant, and responding correctly, the evidence strongly suggests ancient humans were remarkably skilled interpreters of the animal world around them. This wasn't a rare, specialized talent limited to a few gifted individuals. It was very likely a widespread, essential, and constantly reinforced survival skill, built through direct observation, generational knowledge transfer, and in at least the case of wolves, a genuine two-way communication partnership that reshaped the behavior of both species. In many ways, ancient humans understood the practical grammar of the animal world around them with an intimacy modern humans have almost entirely lost, not because they were speaking to animals in words, but because their survival depended on becoming exceptionally accurate readers of every signal the natural world gave them. So could ancient humans understand animal language? Not in the way a fairy tale might suggest, but in a way that's arguably more remarkable, through decades of accumulated life-or-death observation, passed down and refined across countless generations, until reading the animal world became second nature.